Hey everybody, this is Adam from Tungsten Amplification, and today we're looking at a Tweed Bassman. This is not your ordinary Tweed Bassman. This is an exact part-for-part replica of the very famous YouTube Bassman that is owned by Mr. Millstap. If you're not familiar with his channel, check it out. He's a great player, and he is a man in pursuit of tone, which I can appreciate, and I believe everybody watching this video can probably appreciate as well. So we're going to walk through the circuit real quick, kind of just give an overview of what's going on here. If you're already familiar, then bear with me. If you're not familiar, then maybe you'll learn something. I always do. These are your input jacks. Your guitar signal comes through the input jacks, through your input resistors, down to the grids of your V1 tube. There's a shared cathode in V1, so we have a single cathode resistor and a single cathode bypass capacitor. We've got your V1 plate resistors, and in a Fender setup and most other setups, your normal channel is on the right, your bright channel is on the left. These are your output capacitors, your coupling capacitors, from V1 to your volume pots up here. Out of your volume pots, you're going to come back to your mix resistors with your bright side on the left and your normal side on the right. If you're familiar with Marshalls, you'll know that usually there's a treble peaking capacitor across this resistor, but this amp predates that, so they don't have it. Your mix resistors go on to feed V2A, and these components from here to here comprise what's attached to V2A. Let's zoom in just a little bit. You've got your V2A cathode resistor, your V2B cathode resistor, your treble capacitor, bass capacitor, mid capacitor, and a slope resistor down here. That is the entirety of your cathode follower and your tone stack. If that doesn't mean anything to you, that's okay. It can be a little bit confusing. Let's take a quick look at the schematic, because it pertains to some of the differences on this amplifier. So, brief overview. These are the parts we just looked at. This is your tone stack right here. It is fed signal and voltage from your cathode, which is pin 8. Now, for the first couple years that the Millstap amplifier was on YouTube, this wire here was actually attached to the plate, which is pin 7. So instead of having a cathode follower driven tone stack, there was a plate driven tone stack. And then at some point into the series of videos that Millstap did on his Bassman, this wire got placed back on pin 8 where it belongs. So depending on which era of video you're watching, that wire may or may not be in the right place. And when that wire is on pin 7, you have a thinner tone. It's not driving the tone stack nearly as hard. The tone controls are less effective. The tone coming out of the other side of the amplifier, out of the output transformer, is just thinner, a little bit spankier. In some ways it has a little bit more Jimmy sound. And then if you go ahead and you connect it back the way it's supposed to be, you get a thicker tone. The treble, bass, and middle controls work the way they're supposed to. They're much more effective. The amp is being driven a little bit harder. It's the classic tone that you'd be used to. And what I've done in this amplifier, I installed a switch down here that switches between a cathode follower driven tone stack and a plate driven tone stack, so that you can have both of those sounds available. It's not something that needs to be on every amplifier, but in trying to recreate this one amplifier, I wanted to be able to make sure that I could capture both of the eras of its YouTube existence. We're going to move down the board a little bit here and take a look at the V3 components. I did skip over this. This is your filter capacitor for the preamp and the dropping resistor. Everything from here to here, these are your V3 components. And you have a long tail pair phase inverter, And then you have your output section here. So if we look at the phase inverter, you've got your input capacitor and your output capacitor. You've got your two 1 meg plate resistors, and you've got a 470 ohm cathode resistor. The Millstap amplifier has a 5.6K tail resistor, where, when we take a look at the schematic, I think 10K would be the stock value. And that is correct. I don't know if his was modded or if it just came that way from the factory. You go to the output section, we also have plate resistors. We have a 47 picofarad snubber capacitor between them to just tame the highs a little bit. We've got your 220K grid resistors and 0.1 microfarad output coupling capacitors. Next to that is a 27K feedback resistor. That's your negative feedback for the amplifier. Connects on one side to the presence control and on the other side to the speaker output jack. If we move a little bit further down the board, you'll notice that unlike a standard Tweed Bassman, what I've done here, I've put all my filter capacitors inside the chassis. I kind of like to work on amps that way. It's a little bit easier than dealing with a doghouse, especially during construction, where you're trying to place components on both sides of the chassis. If there's room, this is how I always like to do it. If you're following along at home with your schematic, you're going to see that these values in here don't quite match up with the schematic. My understanding of the Millstap amplifier is that at some point it went to a Kendrick Amplifiers in-person class, and the power supply section was rebuilt, a little bit overbuilt in some ways, to give it a bit more punch. So we've got a couple big capacitors in series. Our second stage has been beefed up, and then the third and fourth stages are stock. So there's just a little bit of extra filtering in the front, keeps the hum down, adds a little bit of punch and girth to the low end. You know, it's nothing outrageous that changes the character of the amplifier, just gives you a little bit more right-hand push. While we're looking at the back here, let's take a look. I've got a Mercury Magnetics power transformer. There's a Mercury Magnetics choke on the back. And then for the output transformer, I went with a Sour Sound, which is a high-end boutique hand-wound output transformer. I've used some of Brian Sour's. I've used some of his other output transformers. I really like them. They've got a great sound, a really great feel. When they break up, the grain is just, you know, it's where it should be. I don't use them for everything I build. It's kind of a custom upgrade. But in this version of the Bassman, I want that output transformer. I'm happy with the Mercury power and the Mercury choke, but I want the Sour Sound output transformer in these amps. I'm going to go ahead and scroll down a little bit here. The one other thing that makes the Millstap amp kind of unique is that during its lifetime, all 4 of its speakers were reconed. And they were reconed at different times by different shops using different parts. So they don't all have the same cone, and they don't all have the same dust cover, and I probably don't all have the same voice coil. That gives you a very unique frequency overlap from speaker to speaker, where if one has less mids and the other has more mids, they kind of just blend together into a fat wall of tone. So what I've done here, in the upper left, I have an Eminence Alessandro GA10 SC59, which is an Alnico 20 watter. I think it's their version of a Jensen P10R. On the right side, I have a Tungsten T10Q, which is my Alnico 20 watt P10Q speaker that is made for me by Weber. On the bottom, on the right hand side, I put in a Eminence Legend 1028K, which is a 35 watt Alnico. And on the left side, I put in another Tungsten T10Q. This one just has the bell cover on it, so it looks a little bit different. And what that does for you, it gives you 4 different speakers, well, 3 different speakers, because 2 of them are the same, with a complementary overlap. so that you're not just getting 4 of the same thing. If you've ever mismatched speakers in a Marshall cabinet or anything like that, you know exactly what I'm talking about already. Let me scoot this back a little bit. I'd like to talk about how I have the speakers wired up as well. I've got the Legend, one of the Tungstens, and the Alessandro wired in parallel to the main plug, and that's 2.67 ohms in between the 3 of them. I've got this 4th speaker wired up to its own independent plug, which brings it down to 2 ohms when everybody's plugged in. The reason for doing this is that if you want to, you can unplug the one tungsten speaker here and run these 3 in the same way that you would run a 310 Bandmaster. You're going to drive the speakers harder, you're going to get a little bit more tonal coloration, a little bit of speaker distortion. It's just a different feel, different tone. And it's a nice option to have since there's already holes drilled for it in the chassis. And then when you go ahead and plug in your 4th speaker, you're running at 2 ohms, you've got your 410. It's a standard Tweed Bassman at that point. But again, it's just a nice option to have. It gives you flexibility. It means that you don't have to have a second cabinet if you want to run a 310. You just unplug one speaker. You could even run a 112 out of that extra speaker jack to an external speaker, so you could have your 310 here and maybe like a 112 sitting off to the side. Other than that, that's pretty much it. This is my version of a Bassman right now, subject to change at any moment. If you'd like one of these, I'm always happy to build one. Usually takes a couple months because I have to have the cabinet fabricated. Everything else is done in-house. I make the boards by hand, I drill everything, install the eyelets, polish and bend all the parts, do every solder joint meticulously. I'm a little bit OCD about this stuff. We'll zoom in a little bit more so you can really see. That's as far as we're going to get. Try to get some more light on that. Scoot it in a hair. I am not a professional videographer, as you can tell. My profession is building tube amplifiers, and that is one of the few things I'm good at. Take a final pan past all of these pristine solder joints. I might sprain my arm patting myself on the back. But when it matters, it matters. And this is one of those times where it matters. If you have watched this far, thank you very much. If you own one of my amplifiers, thank you very much. I always appreciate the support. It keeps a roof over my head and it keeps cat food in the bowls. And that is the most important thing. Alright, I'll finish up this pan and we'll be done. I appreciate everybody that watches.